I'm Ramona, 31. I thought Thanksgiving dinner might finally stitch old wounds back together. Instead, my parents laughed. No one here really cares about you. I stayed quiet until I didn't. The clink of glasses, the glow of candles, the smell of roasted turkey, it should have been comforting. Yet in that moment, the words rang louder than the laughter around the table. Their voices cut sharper than any carving knife laid out in front of us. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you've ever felt brushed aside by family, hit subscribe. You'll want to see how this ends. On the drive to my parents' house, I had carried a small, gold-sealed envelope tucked into my purse. My fingers brushed it more than once, imagining a smile, or maybe even a rare nod from my father. They didn't know it yet, but that envelope would decide more than just one evening. The dining room was alive with chatter, my sister Wendy leaning forward, filling the air with tales of her latest campaign at the ad firm. Everyone leaned in. I slid the envelope across to my mother, careful, almost shy. She didn't even glance at it. Instead, she refilled Wendy's glass, her eyes fixed on the rim as if I wasn't even there. I stayed still, letting the weight of the moment settle. This wasn't new. It was the same silence I had known since childhood dinners in Cape Cod, where Dad bragged about Wendy's soccer trophies, while I quietly held a science fair ribbon under the table. Tonight, nothing had changed. Wendy noticed the envelope first. She smirked, tore it open half an inch, then tossed it back onto the bread plate as if it were a coupon. Still trying to buy affection, she muttered, her voice just loud enough for the cousins to hear. They giggled into their napkins. I could feel every eye shift toward me, waiting for my reaction. My father leaned back in his chair, wineglass raised, a smile spreading too wide. "Let's be honest," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "No one in this family actually cares about you." The waiter froze mid-step, his tray hovering as though caught in the air. A cousin stopped mid-sentence. My mother twisted her napkin into a knot, her eyes fixed downward, not one word in my defense. For a moment I felt my face burn, my hands tremble under the table. But then something else steadied me. I smiled, just barely enough to make Wendy's fork pause against her plate. I slid my chair back. The sound of wood scraping across polished floor sliced through their laughter. I whispered one word, "understood." And I stood, every eye following me, as I walked toward the door. What they didn't know was that the envelope still held its secret, its gold seal unbroken. It weighted heavy with promise, and it would change everything they thought they controlled. I walked out of that dining room with their laughter still echoing sharp and thin like broken glass. The November air hit my face as I stepped outside, colder than I expected, but somehow it steadied me. My heels clicked against the stone path, each step measured, deliberate. I didn't look back, not once. Inside, they would go on eating. They'd carve turkey clink glasses and retell the same stories about Wendy's successes. For years, I'd sat at that table hoping to belong, shrinking myself to fit the space they gave me. That night, the truth settled in. No amount of effort would ever shift their gaze toward me. I remembered being 10, standing at the doorway of our Cape Cod house, clutching a first-place science ribbon. My father didn't even look up from his plate. Wendy's speech won her a scholarship, he said, as if that erased me. I swallowed my pride, then the same way I did 100 times after. At Thanksgiving, nothing had changed, only the stakes were higher. My mother's silence stung worst of all. She could have said one word, lifted her head, acknowledged me. Instead, she twisted her napkin tighter and tighter, her lips pressed thin. That silence was the same companion I'd grown up with, and it hurt more than the laughter. When I reached my car, I stopped, my breath visible in the cold. I slipped the envelope back into my purse untouched. Its weight reminded me of the decision I'd already made before walking into that dinner. They thought they knew the rules, that I'd keep trying, keep waiting for crumbs of approval. But I had stopped playing their game. As I started the engine, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face was calm, almost unreadable. No tears, no anger, just clarity, the kind that comes when you finally realize the door you've been knocking on was never meant to open. Understood. I repeated softly to myself this time, not as surrender, but as promise. They wouldn't see me plead again. They wouldn't hear me justify my worth. They had chosen their silence, their mockery, their favorites, and I had chosen something else. I drove away from the house, the glow of its windows fading in the distance. Behind me was the same story I'd lived all my life. Ahead was the part they didn't know, the part that would turn their laughter into something else entirely. The laughter from that dinner followed me long after I drove away. Back in my apartment, Boston's skyline glittered outside my window, but the glow felt hollow. I slipped the untouched envelope onto the counter and stared at it for a long time. They thought it was a gift, a bribe, proof that I was still begging for their affection. In truth, it was something far more decisive. Memories crept in as I set down my purse. I was 10 again, standing in our Cape Cod kitchen, my science ribbon pressed to my chest. Dad never looked up. Wendy's scholarship speech, he said proudly, as if my win didn't exist. Mom sat quietly with her book, letting his words hang heavy in the air. That silence wrapped itself around me then, and I learned to keep my victories hidden. College was no different. I coded late into the night, selling small apps just to pay tuition. When one of them took off, I called home, voice trembling with excitement. Dad said, "That's nice," then turned the conversation to Wendy's new internship. I remember staring at the phone, the line still buzzing in my hand, feeling smaller than ever. Now, at 31, sitting in my own condo with everything I'd built, I realized how little had changed. At the table, Wendy still stole the spotlight with her corner office tales, and Dad still raised a glass to her. Mom still poured wine without meeting my eyes. I'd spent years believing that if I just worked harder, achieved more, maybe they'd see me. That night proved they never would. My phone buzzed on the counter, pulling me back. A text lit up the screen from my lawyer, paperwork's ready. Just say when. I let the message linger before locking the screen. They thought my silence was surrender, but it wasn't. It was the beginning of something they weren't prepared for. I leaned back in my chair, the city lights casting long shadows across the room. For the first time, I didn't feel desperate for their approval. I felt steady, certain. The envelope on the counter remained sealed, but the decision inside it had already taken root. The following morning, I woke with the same heaviness I'd carried since childhood, but this time it didn't pin me down. Instead, it pushed me forward. I brewed coffee, sat by the window, and thought about how every Thanksgiving, Christmas, and family gathering had played out the same way. Wendy's stories filled the room. Dad's praise echoed. Mom's silence lingered like wallpaper, present but lifeless. My place was always somewhere on the edges, expected to smile and not interrupt. I let those memories roll through me, the way Dad's eyes lit up for Wendy's trophies, the way cousins clapped at her promotions, the way my achievements vanished under small talk. At the restaurant last night, I'd felt it again, but this time I wasn't a child holding back tears. I was a woman with choices, with resources, with the ability to walk away. The text from my lawyer replayed in my mind. Paperwork's ready. Just say when. I had already known before stepping into that dinner how far I was willing to go. Their words, "No one cares about you," didn't break me. They confirmed what I'd suspected all along. I was invisible to them unless they could use me. I reached for my phone, opened the message, and stared at it. My fingers hovered over the screen before I set it down again. Not yet. Timing mattered. They thought I'd left the restaurant humiliated, licking old wounds. They couldn't imagine I'd walked out holding the first move in my hand. That night, I met Eric at a small cafe near my office. He listened without interrupting, just nodding as I spoke. "You've carried them for years," he said quietly, his eyes steady. "It's time to stop." His words weren't dramatic, but they settled into me with more weight than any outburst could. As we left the city, air stung cold against my skin. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel like the shadow in my own family. I felt like the one holding the light. The envelope in my purse, still sealed, pressed against my side, with every step reminding me that the story wasn't over. It was only waiting for me to decide when to turn the page. 3 days after Thanksgiving, I drove down to Cape Cod. The sky was steel gray, the air heavy with salt. I parked in front of the house I had inherited from my grandfather, the one my parents always treated as theirs. A bright for sale sign leaned against the porch. My lawyer stood at the door, documents in hand. With one signature, everything shifted. By nightfall, the locks were changed and the house was no longer ours. It was mine to let go. The calls started almost immediately. Dad's voice thundered through the phone. "What the hell have you done, Ramona? That house was our legacy." I held the phone away, listening to the familiar cadence of accusation, then ended the call without a word. A text from Wendy followed minutes later. "You betrayed us. Grandpa would be ashamed." I deleted it as quickly as it appeared. When Dad filed a lawsuit, I wasn't surprised. The thick envelope arrived with sharp legal language accusing me of betraying family trust. I walked into my lawyer's office the next day, Boston's skyline sharp behind her windows. She flipped through the will, her pen tapping lightly. "This is ironclad," she said. "He left it to you alone." Weeks later, the case landed in court. My father sat stiffly at the front, Wendy at his side, both of them avoiding my gaze. The judge read the documents, brows lifting slightly. "There's nothing here," he said, his voice flat. The house was hers to sell. His gavel hit the block, final and decisive. The sound echoed in the silent courtroom. Dad's shoulders sagged, Wendy's lips pressed tight. For the first time, the power they wielded at family dinners meant nothing. I walked out quietly, the cold air biting my heels steady on the courthouse steps. Behind me, their whispers filled the space they once controlled. By that evening, news had spread through the family. Cousins texted me cautiously. "Is it true you sold the house?" Aunts stopped calling. At the next gathering, my parents found themselves under the same scrutiny they had turned on me. I didn't need to lift a finger, the truth had already begun to unravel their pride. That night I sat at my kitchen table with the envelope still resting in my purse. It wasn't a gift, it was the authorization my lawyer had needed to finalize the sale. They had laughed at me, dismissed me, and yet they never realized I'd walked into Thanksgiving dinner holding the one move that would strip away their illusion of control. The fallout came quickly. At Sunday lunch, relatives whispered about how Dad had lost the lawsuit in minutes. My cousin Laura called, her voice uneasy. "Is it true the judge said it was yours all along?" I didn't explain. I only said it's done, and let the silence hang. Meanwhile, Wendy's polished image began to crack. Word spread that she had been managing the family trust, recklessly funneling money into a flashy startup that collapsed. Old family friends began to piece it together, the vacations, the leased car, the gifts she flaunted at Christmas. For years, she'd painted me as the selfish one while quietly bleeding funds meant for everyone. I didn't expose her. I didn't need to. My only action was moving the remainder of the trust, barely $1 million left, into a charity account. I signed the papers, closed the folder, and walked away. A week later, Boston business blogs hinted at an inquiry into her firm's finances. Colleagues stopped defending her. Clients pulled back. When I passed her on the street one afternoon, she looked through me as if I didn't exist. But I saw the tremor in her hands, the way she gripped her phone like a lifeline. She had always believed she could control the story. Now the story was writing itself and she couldn't stop it. I never raised my voice, never posted my side. I simply acted and let the silence do the rest. By then, the family that once laughed at me had grown quiet. Their words carried no weight because the evidence of their own choices spoke louder than I ever could. 1 year later, snowflakes drifted against stained glass windows as I stood in a white dress at a small Boston church. The aisle stretched before me, lined not with relatives who had mocked me, but with friends and colleagues who had become my chosen family. Eric waited at the altar, his smile steady, his eyes grounding me in a way my parents' gaze never had. The absence of my family didn't sting the way I once thought it might. There was no empty seat reserved for them, no half-hearted blessing to collect. Their silence was their choice, and for the first time it no longer felt like a wound. It felt like clarity. As vows were spoken, laughter rippled through the pews, warm, unforced, real. When the ring slid onto my finger, it wasn't just a promise to Eric, but a promise to myself. Never again would I measure my worth against their refusal to see me. Later that winter, at the first gala for the foundation, I named after my grandfather William, I stood at the edge of a crowded ballroom. Lights glinted off chandeliers as a 20-year-old coder nervously pitched her app to investors. I watched her hands tremble, her voice steadying with each sentence, and I saw myself young, overlooked, hungry to prove something. Except this time the room leaned in for her. A journalist pulled me aside afterward, asking why I'd chosen to honor my grandfather's name. I didn't give a speech. I simply unfolded the letter he had left me, his handwriting slanted but firm. "Don't let anyone dim your fire." I held it up without another word. The room grew still before applause filled the air. I didn't need to explain. The truth was visible in the work, in the people who now stood beside me. What I had built came not from bitterness, but from refusing to let their dismissal define me. News of my family's decline reached me through cousins, never directly. My father's lawsuit had drained their savings, leaving them with debts they could no longer hide. My mother, once quietly respected, now carried the weight of her silent siblings who had once admired her, turned away, seeing her as complicit in every cruel word left unsaid. Wendy, once the star, faced charges over the money she had siphoned from the trust. Her firm dropped her clients' cut ties, and her polished reputation collapsed overnight. I read about her downfall in a small article, a photo clipped beside words like embezzlement and reckless spending. I felt no rush of victory, no need to gloat. It wasn't my fight anymore. They had written their own ending. By then, my life was full in a way I had once only dreamed of. The foundation grew funding projects for women stepping into tech with nothing but determination and late-night coding sessions. At the gala, one of the recipients hugged me with tears in her eyes, whispering, "Thank you for seeing me." Her words reached deeper than any toast my father never gave. Eric and I walked home that night, hand in hand, the city lights shimmering against the Charles River. The sound of laughter trailed behind us from the ballroom, but it wasn't theirs, it was mine, chosen, earned, alive. I no longer needed to chase after empty chairs at family dinners. The table I had built was full. And as the church bells echoed in the distance, I understood something I had carried all along. Happiness isn't granted by others, it's claimed when you choose yourself. Sometimes the loudest answer is silence paired with a steady step forward. I left that dinner table behind, but not my dignity. What stayed with me was simple: you don't need every voice to clap for you. One quiet, unwavering belief in yourself can be enough to light an entire room.